Here we go again, folks. All right, so we finished by talking about the love affair between Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and I mentioned that they had two children, Richard and John. Richard being King Richard the Lionheart, famous from the Robin Hood stories, and John, who also became king, his brother. And King John was very unpopular as a result of having to raise taxes, partially because his brother had gone on crusade and spent lots and lots of the government's money. So, all the powers that the kings were getting in England upset the nobles. Their biggest complaint was, of course, about these taxes. And so, what they ended up doing is they ended up surrounding the castle around that King John was living in, and basically said, you cannot leave until you sign these documents. And these documents basically said that the king must consult the nobles before passing any new taxes. This is the first document that I know of, maybe in the entire world, that promotes the notion of a limited government. In that, the king can't just do whatever he wants. He has to consult with someone else before he does whatever it is he's going to do. So this counters absolutism. So what we're going to see is that as a result of the Magna Carta in 1215, we end up with two kind of tracks. We end up with England on one track and other European countries on another track. And so the English notion of limited government that originates in the Magna Carta ultimately becomes the English form of government, but it also is a root of our American government, in that we also believe that the government should be limited, and we limit it by the Constitution and, of course, by the Bill of Rights. And those are all further documents in the development of this notion of limited government. So Prince John, of course, brings to mind Robin Hood, and he might actually have existed. There might have actually been a Robin Hood, but we don't know whether or not he actually existed. And the reason why we don't know is because they actually have access to the prison records from these time periods, and they've looked at them. And one of the interesting things they've seen is that there has been Robin Hoods written down in the prison record. However, there have been multiple Robin Hoods written down in multiple prison records at the same time. So clearly there were several people in England who were calling themselves Robin Hood, at least when they went to prison. The question is, were any of those the real Robin Hood? Was there a real Robin Hood that they were all copycatting, or at least using to justify their crimes? Or was the Robin Hood basically just a myth that people came to use in order to justify their crimes? So we don't really know whether or not there was ever a real Robin Hood, but it's a cool story. Okay, so as I said with the Magna Carta, the Magna Carta ends up leading to limited government, and then it also ends up leading to the Parliament. Because the king is required to consult with the nobles, Edward I ends up creating something called a parliament that basically includes the nobles so that he can consult with the nobles. But he doesn't want to just consult with the nobles because that would give the nobles too much power. So he also includes the bishops. So he's kind of playing off the power of the nobles against the bishops, plus 2 knights of each county. So there's other folks represented. And then just representatives from boroughs and towns. In this way, he was able to gain consent for some significant raises in taxes. So this is interesting because the Magna Carta was originally meant to limit taxes, to keep taxes low, so that the nobles wouldn't have to pay so many taxes. They wanted to get consulted. So it was originally meant to keep taxes low. But ironically, it ends up actually leading to the King of England being able to pass higher taxes in some cases because people were less likely to revolt because they had a voice in which to express their opinions, right? And so people feeling like they had a voice made a big difference, and it actually allowed the government to get away with and do things that other governments might not have been able to do because of fear of revolt and revolution. Okay. This parliament ends up, does not look like this. The current parliament does not look like this. It goes through several phases, one of which there were two halves. There was the upper house and the lower house. And then there's now the lower house, or the House of Commons. So there's the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The lower house now has all of the power in the English government, like all of it. So there's not actually the same type of separation of powers in England that we have here, because now the monarch, or Queen Elizabeth II, has no real power, and the judiciary does have some independence in England, but doesn't ultimately, but it is still ultimately under the Parliament. And so basically, Parliament, this Parliament that's created as just to be advisors to the king, ends up taking over basically all of the power in England by the modern day. Okay, so in contrast to England, where the monarch's power starts off relatively strong because of William the Conqueror, in France, the kings were traditionally weak, and centralized authority was slow to develop. So at the time that the Magna Carta is signed in England, in order to limit the power of the monarch, the French kings are just starting to get the type of power that would upset the nobles. So they're starting later, okay? And so as he starts to take power, he starts to take back land from England. Normandy, Aquitaine, right? These are all familiar names for people who ended up in England. And he's like, okay, well, these lands no longer belong to you, then they belong to France. So remember, William the Conqueror was a vassal to the King of France. And so all of these lands technically belonged to the King of England at the same time that they were in France, and that was like unacceptable to Philip II. This is going to cause a problem later on, okay? But at first he does it, and there's not a war. He then appoints royal officials to rule over his domain. And this is what France looks like around the time of Philip II, okay? So what is actually in 1180, when Philip II first takes power, this right here in dark orange is really all that he has official power over, okay? Then the light orange is what Philip II and his successors start to take over until 1328, okay? And that's what they have direct control over. These pink areas are areas that the nobles still have significant power. So they have loyalty to the King of England, but they have more independent power. And in 1328, this territory down here still technically belongs to England, although that doesn't last. So then the next major king of France that you need to know about is Philip IV, and he establishes a royal bureaucracy to run the government by splitting up his household staff, the people who are running his council, into branches. So he has a finance branch, an advice branch, and he also has something called the Parliament, which is a little bit different than the Parliament that we see in England. In particular, the Parliament were divided into three groups. One was the clergy, the second was the noble, and the third was the townspeople. They end up calling the Parliament the Estates General, because it's the three estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate, the clergy, the nobles, and the townspeople. But it has very little power. There's no documents in France that says that the king actually has to consult with the parliament. He creates it, but then he doesn't really ever consult with it. Okay, this, by the way, is a picture of the three estates visiting a dying king. I can't remember which king it was, whether or not it was Philip IV or somebody else. But so, of course, this is the third estate, the townspeople. This was the second estate, the nobles, and this is the first estate, the clergy, down here. Now, interestingly, what ends up happening in France, and this is not necessary for you to know for the test necessarily, although it might be useful. But what ends up happening in France is that the parliament is, each of these estates are given a vote, one vote. They each get a vote. And what ends up happening is that the nobles and the clergy end up ganging up and using their two votes against the townspeople. And so the townspeople get consistently disenfranchised, basically, because the nobles and the clergy are outvoting them, even though they represent a much, 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 much smaller portion of the population. As a result, what ends up happening is that the third estate, the townspeople, or the common people, end up revolting and overthrowing the government, and that becomes the French Revolution. That's because the way that they structured the parliament way, way, way back in medieval times ends up causing problems down the line, and ends up leading to revolution. Okay, so we've talked about England, we've talked about France, and now we're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire did not exist during ancient times. Okay, this is a new empire. It is not based in Rome. This picture is a little bit misleading. They only controlled Rome for a very brief period of time. Mostly the center of the Holy Roman Empire is in Germany over here, okay? And the joke about the Holy Roman Empire is that it is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was not holy, as we'll see, because it's in constant conflict with the church. It's not Roman because it had very little control over Italy, and only for very brief periods of time. And it was not an empire because it really just ruled over Germanic lands with sporadic influences over other people. And so it really didn't have the same, it really didn't have the same power or expanse of what we would think of when we think of an empire. So remember, Charlemagne was the first person to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but we don't traditionally call his empire the Holy Roman Empire. We call it the Carolingian Empire because there's a break between Charlemagne and then when the Holy Roman Empire is actually founded in 962. Otto is the second person to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and he had helped the church, and so he gets crowned that. On the one hand, what ends up happening is, like in England, he's trying to play the nobles off of the clergy like they do in Parliament. But he's just not very good at it, and he tries to control the church, and this ends up causing problems, particularly because Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a different Henry IV than in England, it gets confusing, I know, gets in trouble with the church, who ends up, Henry IV, basically in the investiture crisis, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, okay, these are going to be the bishops, these are going to be, in my lands, right? Because the bishops had a lot of power, and he wanted the bishops to be his allies so that they would support him. And the church is like, no, we get to choose who is going to be we are going to choose who is going to be the bishops. It's our decision within the church. You need to keep the church business separate from your business, and you don't get to decide because you're not the Pope. And so Henry IV still tries to appoint bishops, which gets him in big trouble. And so Pope Gregory II had claimed the right to depose all emperors and absolve their subjects from their allegiance to their leaders, which is what they do with Henry IV. So they basically say, okay, people under Henry IV don't follow him. He is excommunicated, and you should not follow him. And until he leaves power, there will be no sacraments. There will be none of these things. And so Henry IV freaks out when this happens to him because he doesn't want the people to revolt. And so he goes to, what ends up happening is he actually he goes to apologize to the Pope, and he doesn't go by himself. He goes with his soldiers. And so the Pope becomes convinced as Henry IV is coming to apologize to him, that Henry IV is coming to kill him. And so he runs away, and Henry IV runs after him, but to apologize, but the Pope doesn't believe that he's there to apologize. He believes that he's there to kill him. So he runs and he hides in a castle. And this is a very bad medieval rendition of a castle. And this is Henry IV outside of the castle. I know the picture doesn't make any sense, but that's okay. On some type of, I don't know what this is. This is craziness over here. But anyway, what he's doing is he's in the snow. You can't see this, but he's in the snow and he's begging for forgiveness. And so, and what he does is, here he has socks on, but eventually or shoes on. Eventually what he does is he takes his socks and shoes off, and he begs in the snow for the Pope to forgive him, basically risking losing all of his toes and causing there to be all this blood on the snow. Anyway, so as we see with this Henry IV and the previous ruler in England, let's go back to him. This is Henry II, right? The previous ruler. Do you remember this? And Henry II, is that what ends up happening is when there is a conflict between the church and the kings during the High Middle Ages, the church wins. And again, as I alluded to earlier in the previous lecture, this does not always happen. The church does not always win. Eventually, the kings start to win, and that causes all kinds of chaos in Europe once the kings start to win. But right now, the church is winning, and the kings are basically forced to do what the church says. All right. Frederick I and II end up continuing in this very failed relationship with the church. They attempt to control Italy and take over Italy, which of course the Pope doesn't like. They try to take over more land than they should have. And basically what ends up happening is that Frederick I and II are rebuked by the church. They lose military power because they're spread too thin, and the government loses all credibility. And so this is what the Holy Roman Empire looks like, right? These are all different principalities, and there is still a Holy Roman Emperor after Frederick II, but they exercise no real power over this territory. Basically, Germany is just led by different principalities, okay? And there is no unified government of Germany until the 1800s. So this is interesting, okay? Because Germany is disunified because of Frederick I and Frederick II, what ends up happening is that Germany doesn't actually get unified until the 1800s. And when they do, they become this power within Europe, and the other European countries freak out, right? They are like, oh my gosh, they had already fought all their wars. We're gonna learn about a lot of wars that they fought in order to establish power, right? And so they kind of created some type of peace or détente where they're not fighting each other anymore. But then this new player comes on the scene. They all freak out. They all start to arm themselves like crazy in order to be able to defend themselves against this new power of Germany. Then there's also power in Italy as well. And so they're all trying to defend themselves against this. And this leads to this great rise in militarization in Europe, which ultimately ends up leading to World War I, because everybody is so scared of Germany. They militarize, they get all these guns, and then, of course, they feel like they have to use them. And so they start fighting against one another. That's one cause. Militarization is one cause. There are other causes of World War I in 1914, as we will see later on, actually, in this lecture. And in fact, where World War I starts is in Serbia, right here, which we're going to talk about right now. Okay, so this area, so here's Italy. This area right here is known as the Balkan Peninsula. And in particular, when we talk about the Balkans, we're talking about this area right here, not as much Greece when we talk about the Balkans. This area right here, so there's right now, there's Croatia, okay, and Serbia, and then Albania down here. And they each become allied with different religious groups, okay? So Croatia is like closer to Western Europe over here, so they become Catholic. And Serbia, closer to the east here and to like the Byzantine Empire and that type of thing, so they become Eastern Orthodox. Albania, again, remember, a lot of territory around here is controlled by, down to the south over here, is controlled by Muslims, and you also have the Ottoman Empire that ends up coming up and getting into here. They end up becoming Muslim. And so this is going to ultimately end up creating some problems, okay? So all of this area right here was all considered Yugoslavia for a time. There was a country called Yugoslavia here. Okay? Yugoslavia no longer exists. But if you look at Yugoslavia right here, right, it was all one country, but they all identified with different religions, different nationalities. They had different languages. Okay? And so what ends up happening is that after the Cold War, when Yugoslavia breaks apart, and Yugoslavia was basically controlled by somebody who kind of identified with the communists, and when communism no longer was a thing, he basically goes away, and this whole area breaks apart. Okay, and then what ends up happening is that basically Serbia tries to basically expel, because there are Muslims living in Serbia right here, right? There's some Muslims. And they try to expel all these Muslims down here in what's called Kosovo, right? And expel them or just kill them, right? This was called ethnic cleansing, okay? And they also got into a conflict with Bosnia over here, trying to take over some of the territories with people who identified as Serbian, and then attacking people in Bosnia. And as a result of all of this, what ends up happening is that Bill Clinton actually ends up deciding to go in and bomb Serbia in order to get them to stop their militarization and their ethnic cleansing of in Kosovo and in Bosnia and these types of things. Anyway, and so now they're all separate countries, but there's still conflict, as you will read in a document after this lecture. Okay. And so this conflict in the Balkans between different religious groups, between the Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Muslims, it's still there today. It's still there today. Okay, so then let's go further east to Russia, and then we're going to go back to the Balkans, but let's go further east to Russia. So Russia converts to Orthodox Christianity because a Kievan Rus leader, which is one of the groups that ultimately ends up forming into Russia, ends up marrying the Byzantine emperor's sister and converting to Christianity in 988. And after the Orthodox Church splits from the Catholic Church in 1054, Russia remains Orthodox because of that previous alliance. We're going to come back to this in just a second. So remember, Russia is Orthodox. You have to remember this in order to understand partially what causes World War I. Okay. Okay, let's go back. Let's talk about Alexander Nevsky, and then we'll go back to the Balkans and talk about Russia and Orthodox and Serbia and World War I. But Alexander Nevsky actually defends from the Germans in 1242, but he cooperates with Mongol invaders. And his descendants become the royalty of Russia for a time. And so what's interesting to note is that Russia was ruled by Mongols for a time. They were ruled by nomadic warriors, horse riding nomadic warriors who believed in kind of like absolutism and the ruling of a great Khan, which of course reminds me of Vladimir Putin today, who loves getting pictures of himself taken on a horse without his shirt on. Anyway, we'll learn more about Vladimir Putin. No, and there's Vladimir Putin killing a polar bear and making sure that everybody knows that he killed the polar bear because, I'm not saying that Vladimir Putin was inspired by the Mongols of his country's history, but he definitely sometimes seems kind of like a Mongol ruler. Okay, so let us now go back to Serbia. So this is a great story. Okay, so right before World War I, the Austria, which is right here, tries to lay claim to all of this territory. They want to. Austro-Hungary is an empire, and Austro-Hungary wants to lay claim to all of this in order to expand their borders. Okay, and remember, Germany is rising in power. They're militarizing. Austro-Hungary is now trying to militarize and expand their borders. So Austria sends an emissary to Serbia and named Franz Ferdinand, and there's a band recently that was named Franz Ferdinand. But anyway, they send a representative, Franz Ferdinand, to Serbia to basically go on parade and try to basically convince the Serbian people that they really want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, so what ends up happening is that there's these Serbian nationalists who hate the idea of Austria controlling them. So they try to kill the Franz Ferdinand, and it's kind of an incident of like historical comedy. Okay, so what ends up happening is they originally try to kill him while he's on parade, but then they can't find him, or they can't get him or something like that, and so Franz Ferdinand ends up realizing that there's a murder plot against him, and so they end up changing their course, but then they get lost, and they stop in front of a sandwich shop while they're lost. Okay, and they're opening their map and they're trying to figure out where they're going to go. Well, it turns out that one of the assassins had decided that he was hungry, and so he went into the sandwich shop to go buy a sandwich, and he looks out the window of the sandwich shop, and he sees Franz Ferdinand's people and Franz Ferdinand there looking at a map, and so he goes out of the sandwich shop and he shoots Franz Ferdinand, and Franz Ferdinand dies, which causes a major international incident. What ends up happening is that Austria declares war on Serbia. Now remember, Serbia is Orthodox. So is Russia. Russia is also Orthodox. They also speak a Slavic language that Serbians do. So they see Serbians as kind of their little brother. So Russia comes in and protects Serbia by declaring war against Austro-Hungary. Well, unbeknownst to Russia, Austro-Hungary had created an alliance with Germany against Russia. So Germany declares war against Russia. Well, unbeknownst to Germany, Russia had created an alliance with France against Germany. And so France ends up declaring war against Germany. And then France had created an alliance with Great Britain against Germany. So Great Britain comes to war against everything. And we are in World War I. Okay? So, because a Russian Kievan prince converts to Christianity in 988, which later becomes Orthodox Christianity, and because Serbia becomes Orthodox during the medieval period, and because one guy gets shot in Serbia, we end up in a World War I situation, okay? It's not obviously just because of those conversions, right? There were a lot of other things that went into it. But alliances and all of these crazy alliances that people were making right before World War I is considered to be one of the causes of World War I. So anyway, if you didn't catch that, I totally understand. But I will be linking to this lecture on my website, so you can go and listen to all of that again if you're interested. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. What you're going to do right now is you're going to do a reading about the continuing conflict in the Balkans area between the Orthodox Muslims and Christians. And then you have free time to be able to go ahead and work on your essays or your homework 12.3 that's due, or anything else that you need to do. Okay, thanks.